I'm not entirely better yet. I'm not nearly as better as I was hoping I would be by now. Yesterday, I felt thoroughly pumped and energized, and that's why I did an exegetical reading that night. And then that was something that I re-streamed like publicly today, and I was just had a bunch of busy work, and I was getting prepared for this lecture, and then I felt totally just tired and like my head hurt, and I took an afternoon nap, thinking I would feel better afterwards, and I feel a little bit better, but I'm like, wow, geez, this is I'm on the I'm on something. And I was thinking maybe let's tell the story real quick. Anne, I don't know if you're there right now, if you want to, but basically she and I went to a restaurant, and this was the day before when this lecture was supposed to take place. And I passed out. I took 2 bites of my taco, and then I said, I'm feeling dizzy. And then I said, I've
Yeah,
never
you're
felt
like,
this.
I'm really dizzy. I've never felt like this before. And then I had noticed that like Dave's face was all pale. I was like, oh, you're pale. And then all of a sudden Dave's eyes like roll back and he just passed out against the wall for like 10 to 15 seconds. We laugh about it now. It was crazy in the moment. But and then his lips were like purple after that. And you've just kind of been tired on and off since then. You're muted.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, our initial hypothesis was just exhaustion, and that makes a lot of sense. I think there were some other factors. We got blood tests, and we're still working through figuring things out, but for the time being, resting up is essential. I'm trying to pace myself, but this is the big thing. This, I will do an exegetical reading for They Know Not What They Do again this week, and then there will be the For They Know Not What They Do class this weekend. But this is the one I'm most excited about, and I'm also most trepidatious concerning, because lecture 3 in the series, there's only one more lecture to really kind of pull this piece of the overall Theory Underground courses apparatus together, right? This piece being the PMC course. So welcome everybody to the PMC Consciousness and Ideology course through Theory Underground. This is the only course that we are streaming live. The other courses have remained private, and there will be pieces of them released over time perhaps, but this is one that we thought we wanted to do publicly. And I'm glad that we are doing it publicly. It does make it feel, though, I think, like, I don't know, like the students perhaps have, I mean, what's the point of becoming a student when you can just watch it on YouTube, right? And so there's like it kind of putting it behind that wall, and people having to buy into it, I think adds some sort of value. I don't really understand how these things work, but it seems like that might be the case. But nevertheless, some people are getting value from it now, and something I want to talk about is that I think a lot more people are going to get a lot more value from it in the future. So, with having said that, I'm David McCarricker. I'm the host of Theory Underground here, and the co-host or teacher of this course is Elton LK of the Working Class Intelligentsia. So, welcome, Elton.
Good evening.
The
Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. I am really excited for what we're doing here. And we've received really cool feedback yesterday from someone in the comment section of one of the videos on the playlist for the PMC course saying, I'm a Trotskyist-leaning Marxist, worldview Marxist who has been binging this whole series, and I find it so illuminating and helpful. Thank you so much. And I was thinking, that's one of the advantages to having it all posted public, is that people can just binge it all while they're working. And the PMC conversation or debate is kind of out of vogue right now because, well, you can probably expect that it will return towards the end of the next election period. But that's when it comes about, is usually once people get off of their, you need to support the left-leaning party no matter what kind of bandwagon because they're just really worried about winning. After that's over, the PMC discourse usually returns. And I think it would return. I don't know if it'll return as hard this next time around as it did in 2020. The reason it came so strongly in 2020 was because people saw within basically a 8-year period, well, actually, I guess it's more like a 6-year period, Bernie running and then rerunning and seeing everything revolving around that. People conflating like an Elizabeth Warren with a Bernie Sanders, or in a more ridiculous way, conflating all of these more centrist neoliberals who are kind of picking up various of his talking points and then using their identities at the same time. And it just kind of made him seem, well, he's just the old man who doesn't really have anything original to say because they're all saying basically the same things now. And he didn't really help his case by, in the second time around, capitulating in a lot of ways to the Identitarian PMC spokespeople, activists, and really just the kinds of personalities that are associated with, and roles that are associated with the Democratic Party and its nonprofit complex. So the betrayal of the universalist politics and the capitulation to the oh, well, you need to make sure to talk about us. You need to make sure to talk about us. And also being worried about, being blamed for Trump, for Trump winning or for Hillary losing last time around. He was going a lot more softball on the Democratic Party and going a lot harder on Trump himself, which is like, it's just easy picking. It's just like if there's a bully around and you just keep being like, you're a bully, you're a bully. It's just like, okay, you just sound like everyone else right now. You actually have an original message, but you're not holding to it. What's going on with that? And so people had to think, what is going on with that? And so there's a variety of theories. The PMC theory was the one that after assessing a variety of various theories, including like labor aristocracy and, obviously the standard Marxist interpretation that had a ready-made interpretation that's been around for the last 100 years that gets used every time this happens. I was like, no, this PMC thing is kind of onto something, huh? But then I realized that didn't really seem like anybody was doing the readings. And so, Elton and I, we've been having our conversations about it. He's been leading these discussion groups in Boise, and now we are here. And we both think it's important to set up this basis of material now so that whenever it becomes relevant again, whenever people are ready to start wondering, why do we keep losing? They can actually get a basis in the texts and not just, oh, it's a slur that's used to describe kind of limousine liberals, which is kind of how it gets talked about today. But one thing I wanted to address before we turn it over here to Elton was a Stalin supporter who came into my live chat. I don't usually abide the Stalin sympathizers very much. I just basically treat them like Nazis, even though I know they're different. Just because, not because I don't understand why a person might get sucked into that. Like you watch some Michael Peretti, then you go and you read some Grover Furr. Oh, there you go. That makes sense, especially if you haven't read a lot of other things. Totally makes sense why that would be a phase that a person might go through. But I just don't humor it much because it's just not my wheelhouse. I've got a lot of reasons for it not being my wheelhouse. But they said that they consider PMC theory to be social democrat theory. And so that's what I wanted to address really quickly here. It's not in any way, shape, or form just a social democrat theory. If we really want to say that it starts with James Burnham, which I think is wrong, because really a lot of other people around at his time were giving their own versions of it, he was a Marxist. And he gives a Marxist argument for the managerial revolution. Right? As if you watched the last lectures, you should understand a little bit about that. I also did exegetical readings of the first half of that book, and I think that you should definitely check that out if you're curious. But Barbara Ehrenreich is one of the founding members of the Democratic Socialists of America. She's a socialist. She's not just a soc dem. She's willing to work in any capacities to make it happen. But she believes that the point is that the PMC needs to become less inherently repulsive to the blue-collar workers so that the PMC can better organize by understanding that populist resentment is based in a legitimate and objective class antagonism. Scorning it or writing it off as reaction, it's not going to work. It's not. In fact, it emboldens it, and it obviously gives a monopoly on some very important issues to grifters like Tucker Carlson. Thomas Frank, who we've talked about in this course, is more of a soc dem. And from his position, it's a lot more just like he's focused on the way that meritocracy is reified by the PMC. And we talked about that in the first week's lectures. But what about revolutionaries, you might ask? Because obviously James Burnham was a revolutionary who turned coat in a sort of sense. So are there any other like revolutionaries? Like Ehrenreich's working in a reformist capacity, though she's open to revolution. But who's an actual revolutionary who is thinking about the PMC? And I just wanted to point out the obvious. His name was Mao. Okay, now you might not love Mao. You might not think that his programs or his solutions were great. And I have a lot of hesitations, and caveats that we could bring into play here. But the point is that after the USSR became a fully entrenched bureaucracy with no hope of ever achieving anything like socialism, yet saying, we are socialism and we've achieved it, comrade. Now get back to work. Mao said, oh shit, we don't want to do that in our revolution, so we're going to have to do something different. So then he took all the intellectuals and sent them out into the fields to work in the rural areas to humiliate them, right? But the question is why is that humiliating? Everyone else has to do it. Everyone else has to do backbreaking labor. Why is it humiliating to send an intellectual out there? Well, that's the point, was to say, maybe we shouldn't have like this elitist attitude towards people who actually work in fields, That didn't necessarily work. I don't know. Maybe it did. I really am not an expert on the China situation today. Neither am I an expert on the Cultural Revolution. My point is only this. All of these people, revolutionary, social democrat, socialist, conservative, former Trotskyist, whatever, it doesn't matter. All of these various stripes of people agree that this thing exists. They all try to describe what this thing is in their own ways. And contending with this situation that draws a serious problem for politics, whether you are a revolutionary or a reformist, they all come to different conclusions. And all of those conclusions can and should be critiqued. But being a free-thinking person who's looking for new solutions, we're going to have to work through the thing they're contending with, which is the PMC. That's kind of what I wanted to run through, is just that this is a sort of bipartisan presentation of the PMC, but not bipartisan. It's a multipolar partisanship. It's really everybody who has completely different interests saying, no, well, this thing exists. And so what people like to do if they don't want to focus on this issue is they take the person who held the thesis that they like the least and that they think their audience won't want to be associated with, and then they say, oh, well, it's that person's idea. Oh, well, that's a Maoist idea. Oh, well, that's a Burnhamite idea. Oh, well, no one says that's an Ehrenreich idea if they're a socialist, though, right? Because they would much rather erase her. Now, we have already had a lecture on the first essay by Barbara Ehrenreich, and now it is time for the second. So that's what Elton's here to do today, is going to talk about the gatekeepers in the PMC. So welcome to the stage here, Elton.
Thank you. Yep. And yeah, I just support everything you just said. That's all. And I also wanted to say that I love the exegetical readings as an approach to, essentially that's like a work that you're doing and putting out there. I think it's great that people have access to these readings then now in audio form, and you being able to talk through them in addition to the other texts in the course. So keep up the good work. Okay, so so this is part 2 of the Ehrenreich's, essentially making the argument for the existence of the PMC as a class. And, I've expressed, a little bit of ambivalence about it. I'm still, doing some of my own research on what Marx thought a class was, and I even recently discovered like a little passage that is in Capital Volume 3, where it's clear that Marx like actually hasn't really thought through how you define a class. So I think that there's still work to be done there, and that essentially Marx would encourage this kind of exploration. And this part 2 is interesting because part 1 of the PMC essay is really trying to say like there's a historical moment where the PMC came into existence and essentially tried to protect their interests against both the working class and the capitalist class so that they could grow as a class and continue to, reproduce themselves as class through PMC institutions that they built. Part 2 then is really they call it a case study, but basically it's what happened, a generation or two later with those PMC institutions and the children of the PMC. So I'll get to that in a moment, but I wanted to start first with the end, which is why are the Ehrenreichs talking about this in the first place? And what is it that they want to see? Like what would socialism look like as it relates to the PMC? And, I think being honest, I don't think that they describe that very well anywhere. But Ehrenreich, Barbara Ehrenreich is an incredible writer, and in Fear of Falling and in later texts, she just, especially when she gets to the end of the book, she just, ties everything together and writes, a conclusion that, gives you some high level understanding of why you just read the book, and also build some level of excitement about it. I'm going to read the end of Fear of Falling, about a page worth, because I think it kind of ties all of this stuff together. I'll actually give a pretty short lecture when we actually talk about the essay itself, but I wanted to give this context, and then towards the end I'll actually read the end of another book that she wrote, because I think it also does a good job of tying the vision together about kind of the PMC and socialism as she's fighting for. Okay, so this is right at the end of Fear Falling. But even for the middle class, the way out does not lie through the simple revival of professionalism. The elitism of the professions, excuse me, the elitism of the professions with their steep and often arbitrary barriers of education and licensing hurts not only the excluded members of the lower classes, but those who are by birth most likely to be included. So with the PMC, one of the key pieces of their argument is that they implement barriers to entering the PMC, which distinguishes them from the working class the reason why the book's called The Fear of Falling is because they essentially try to make that gap as wide as possible, a century ago and continue to this day by, having, licensing and different ways to keep the professions limited in who can actually, like that there's some scarcity around being able to get into the PMC. And by doing that, then they kind of, feel like they're ensuring themselves and their children and their class some protection from falling back into poverty, back into the working class. And she's basically saying it creates a level of anxiety that, first of all, they're not successfully able to, especially since neoliberalism, which is, after this book is written. But okay, so this is the catch in the strategy of professionalism and the source of so much middle-class anxiety. The barriers erected to exclude intruders from other classes also stand in the way of the youth of the middle class. The barriers, and pay attention, she's talking about the youth of the middle class. We'll get to that later. The barriers ensure that only the hardworking, the self-denying will make it, and not even all of them. Hence the fear of hedonism, of growing soft and ultimately falling. Hard work and self-denial become our punitive values, that's in quotes, setting us against all those who have not yet made it, the young, the poor, and even against our own desires. But if we start with what needs to be done, we can see that the middle class's anxious sense of scarcity is in no small part self-imposed. There is potentially no limit to the demand for skilled, creative, and caring people, no limit to the problems to be solved, the needs to be met by human craft and agency. I think that's, I'll reread that because I think that's the crux of it. But if we start with what needs to be done, we can see that the middle class's anxious sense of scarcity is in no small part self-imposed. There is potentially no limit to the demand for skilled, creative, and caring people, no limit to the problems to be solved, the needs to be met by human craft and agency, which is to say that the work that the PMC is doing, there's plenty to go around, and we don't need to limit who has access to doing that work. The mentality of scarcity may be appropriate to the realm of consumer goods for the obvious reasons of fairness and ecology, but it has no place in the realm of conscious, responsible effort and achievement. In an egalitarian future, there would be enough work to go around, and work pleasurable enough so that all will want it. This is not a matter of lowering standards, but of opening doors, removing artificial barriers and expanding educational opportunity to all comers, which is obviously what Theory Underground is about as well. But in the process, education itself must change, abandoning its restrictive biases by race and sex, as well as class, downplaying competition. The long process of growing up and preparing for an adult occupational role need no longer be an exercise in deferring gratification, which she focuses a lot in Fear of Falling about the PMC deferring gratification. And that's one of the things that helps them self-righteously distinguish themselves from the working class. They like to, slander the working class for their lack of discipline. Permissiveness would cease to be a threat and an excuse for class injustice. For growing numbers of people of all backgrounds, the path of self-indulgence would lead straight on from the pleasure of learning to the joy of chosen work. At the point where education becomes the free exercise of the mind, and I think that's critical, education becomes the free exercise of the mind, it would inevitably cease to be the mechanism of class reproduction. It would be too exuberant, too playful to remain in quiet service to social inequality. Everyone would want it. The barriers erected to keep out the others would tumble, and the hungry of all ages would swarm in. This, very simply, would be the program of the professional middle class and the agenda it brings to any broader movement for equality and social justice. And then last sentence, to expand the class, welcoming everybody until there remains no other class, which I think is pretty shocking. But if I understand correctly, she's arguing essentially to remove the barriers to the PMC for the sake of making and I think there's more to be said here, but for making essentially the PMC the universal class, that essentially we could make everybody PMC, but obviously a different kind of PMC, that the nature of PMC would have to change. And this was written in, what was it, 89 or something, late 80s. And, and I think that there's, some, I don't know if naivety is the word, but we'll get to that in a little bit. All right, so I think that is a pretty good context to set for this case study of the PMC in the 60s and the 70s, which is what it was about. So we'll talk about the PMC and especially the radicals in the professions. So in this, in the passage I just read, she's talking about essentially opening up the professions to everybody. And the text this time talks a little bit about an actual movement where that started to happen, and I think was probably one of the biggest inspirations for the Ehrenreichs. Okay, so it starts with the golden age of the PMC, which is an era where many people look fondly and kind of idealize in American history, which is the 50s after World War II. You're building on the New Deal, and then World War II. A lot of people come back, they get the GI Bill, so it's even bringing a lot of working class people into the PMC by giving them access to university. The economic model at the time is Keynesianism, which Ehrenreichs don't mention in particular, but basically Maynard Keynes is another one of the quote great economists, and at that time it meant that there was a lot of common sense that said we should pay taxes and invest in government programs. And those government programs created a lot of jobs for the PMC. And people were pretty happy with the PMC on some level, especially when you look at things like the space program. So NASA was, I think landing on the moon, even it, as I understand it, it's kind of like it didn't matter who you were. If you were an American, you were proud to be an American at that moment. And it was really the PMC, the scientists, had accomplished something. You also had Kennedy, who was a pretty important moment for the PMC. And I mentioned him because I think the Ehrenreichs call him out as kind of a PMC president that was loved by many. But the same moment, or I should say, the children of that PMC were recognizing the hypocrisy in the PMC. They were recognizing the incredible investment in the military, and that the military was covering, the whole globe in imperialist actions and wars, anti-democratic revolutions, and the CIA was responsible for all kinds of injustices around the world. So that right there is kind of the tipping point that you start to see in the, well, I shouldn't say you start to see, but one of the most important moments in the youth of the PMC is 1962. You have the, the Port Huron Statement, where the self-identified New Left was essentially made it known kind of like where they stood. So the New Left was separating itself from the old class-based Marxist left. They were no longer deeply integrated with the labor movement or the working class. Instead, they were the PMC youth that went to college and saw themselves as no longer racist like the old left was. And they were also critical of capitalism. And there were other things, feminism and stuff like that. But the Port Huron Statement, the Ehrenreichs talk about how it was both critical of capitalism and the military and the old PMC, because they had basically been bought out by the capitalist class in order to fight their imperialist wars and essentially spread imperialism. But then they were also critical of the working class for its racism and some other stuff like that. The important point is it was the New Left kind of forming and taking a stand, essentially as not only as a class, but also as the children of a class. So that was 1962. Of course, we have the civil rights movement that was forming at that time. And it even starts to radicalize into the Black liberation movement. So you've got like Black Power movement, which is, almost entirely a working class movement. But what's interesting is that they are, Marxist in many ways. They identified with the rejection of imperialism around the world. So part of the anti-imperialist movement around the world, and this goes back, much further, like half a century or even maybe Marx. There's the concept of self-determination. So there were, colonies that wanted independence from England, for example. They're essentially demanding self-determination. You also see this in Ireland, the Basque people, all kinds of people in Eastern Europe, where the Ottoman Empire was. So the Black Power movement was essentially calling for self-determination in American communities. So you have poor Black communities saying basically they're sick of the PMC coming in and telling them how to live their lives, and looking down on them, etc. So part of the Black Power movement was community control. So they were demanding, essentially, we want to be responsible for our own health care as much as possible. We want to be responsible for taking care of our children when it comes to, the school lunches and breakfasts and those kinds of things. There were a number of different things that in part one of the PMC essay that the PMC overtly extracted from working class communities that in the Black Power movement, they were essentially taking back from the PMC. So the New Left had to make a choice. Where were they going to stand on this? Where they had previously taken a stand and said that they were with the civil rights movement, now they had to come to terms with the fact that they were, as a class, the bad guys, and they needed to distance themselves from the PMC, that the PMC was the oppressing class of the poor Black communities. And I'm saying Black communities, but this was of course outside of Black communities. I know that there were white communities that even joined in with the Black Panthers. I can't remember their names, and there's probably far more than I actually know about. And then of course there's the Young Lords, who are the Puerto Ricans. They also participated in a lot of the same kind of politics. So then, like I said, this forced the young PMC to take a stand, and it split the PMC. And when I say the PMC, really, I'm talking about a fraction. We're still talking about a small number of people.
A vocal and young minority of the PMC.
Exactly.
But it was the prominent one in media, and it was split between, we should empower communities to, from the ground level, have autonomy, and then the other side that was like, no, they still need us white social workers to come in and make sure they do the right things,
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's interesting that Barbara Ehrenreich actually is one of the famous feminists. And in fact, I've got, I'll read from this in a moment, that like she's got a, important feminist work here, but she's calling out the New Left feminist movement for essentially remaining PMC, whereas you ended up having another group of the New Left that became anti-PMC, basically said, how can we stop being distinct from, like, how can we stop being a distinct class with our distinct interests that are opposed to the working class? Instead, they wanted to overcome that divide and align themselves with the working class, whether it was Black communities or whatever, and support the community control movement. And they did that in a number of different ways. And I read some additional articles that talked about how fundamentally they failed to do anything through collective action. It ended up becoming just one more political movement at that time that was just done with, a bunch of people with good intentions, but they didn't, get organized in order to create some institutions that would reproduce themselves. So what you had was, in particular, there was a movement called the radicals in the professions, for example, where you had individual lawyers or doctors or some kind of healthcare professional or teachers that tried to work within their institutions in one form or another and bridge that gap between the working class and create a relationship where they were no longer condescending, but instead were collaborating with their patients or whatever. And basically what ended up happening is as soon as the economy started to you had inflation in the early 70s, as soon as that started to go south, then the control of the PMC institutions recognized that they needed to cut corners, or they needed to cut costs, and the radicals in the professions ended up being the ones that were the first to go. There's an element where they probably were consciously saying, like, no, we want to retain our identity as PMC, but there's probably a lot of it that was just quote, the realities of the situation. So the radicals in the professions essentially just disappeared overnight. They may have continued doing their work, but they had to be, quote, realistic about what they could do, and no longer doing it as a public service, etc. Go ahead.
I think that in a couple of cases, like sort of democratized, or at least like, I don't know, by the people, for the people style clinics exist still to this day. Like, but they kind of exist in these little liberal blue
pockets,
utopias, like a Portland,
yeah.
But there are little stragglers on, kind of still existing
Totally.
from that. Yeah.
That totally makes sense. Yeah.
And in a sense, right, like you and I both studied philosophy and decided not to go stay as a specialist who only speaks to the children of the PMC, and decided to start our own independent education, things that we can do outside of that. And so in a sort of sense, it is like an impulse that we ourselves have felt, and that a lot of people feel when they start doing online education, not just keeping it in the university, right? And so it might not be organized in that sense, but we're kind of doing the freelance version of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. But yeah, democratize the professions. That was a phrase I meant to say. That was definitely at the heart of it, is they were trying to democratize the professions. I should also mention that there's definitely a part of the anti-PMC that created the new communist movement, and they wanted to put the working class at the center of their socialism, and they did basically a bunch of things in order to prove that they supported the working class. But admittedly, I think it's even in the DNA of DSA now, because there was a lot of kind of stupid and embarrassing things that they did at that time. I think like Barbara Ehrenreich talks about like somebody getting a job at a factory, trying to blend in with the working class, and nobody at the factory would talk to him because they thought they were a narc. They just like had cleaned up thinking that the working class, wouldn't trust a hippie, kind of thing. But instead, the reality was that the working class, was living in the same historical, moment that they were as well. So I think that's the crux of the text. And again, thanks for reading, the text. I think that was the crux of the text is that they talk about this moment where, really the PMC became self-conscious and, essentially wanted to reject the existence of the PMC. And I think, like, especially reading this, what is it, 50 years later, or 45, I don't know, I don't do math, but reading this many years later, I feel like at the time they may have been writing about this case study as if like this was our hope. We just need more anti-PC PMC, and that that was even maybe what they were making the case for with Democratic Socialists of America. From my perspective, I think it was doomed to failure from the beginning because it was always going to be such a minority, and on some level just kind of like a moral argument, which we don't need to talk about the the Marxist concept of kind of like moral arguments just never, you can't build a political movement on a moral argument. Like it can be in there, but you're just never going to persuade a mass movement on that kind of argument. And yeah, but that being said, I wanted to wrap up by talking a little bit more about Barbara Ehrenreich, and then I'll hand it over to you. But okay, so conclusions. First of all, I wanted to say again, Barbara Ehrenreich, in her childhood, so she grew up in Montana. Her dad was a coal miner. I think he was a, socialist all along. So she grew up in that kind of household, like he was involved with the labor movement. And then at some point decided he wanted to become a academic, which, is kind of funny because she talks about him being very critical of the PMC all along. Like never trust a lawyer, a doctor, or whatever, they're full of it. And then, of course, Barbara Ehrenreich, she actually got a chemistry degree or something like that. She actually became a scientist. And I'm sure grew up in this new left movement that we're, talking about. So I think that this is, very personal for her. And then, of course, her husband at the time. I think with what we've talked about with the PMC and why they're making these arguments is, first of all, they want self-conscious PMC radicals, so that they can recognize themselves as the oppressors. And these are the short-term goals, I think. And so then essentially they can, start to recognize that they have shared interests with the working class against capital, which is to say, essentially just they're still selling their labor power, working for the man, that kind of stuff. But then her longer term goals, and I think this is maybe some of the more interesting piece of what we're talking about here. I mean, there's a lot of interesting aspects to it, but it's just that I think fundamentally she wants to create a world. She wants to imagine a world where we remove the gatekeepers from the PMC, especially the professions. I don't think she's necessarily worried about the management side as much, but focused on the professions that so this book, which I'll read from in just a moment, called For Her Own Good, she starts the book actually talking about the Middle Ages and about how integrated people's lives were, which is to say that it's not like they, left home to go to the office and spend the day, working, building their career and that kind of stuff, and then come home at the end of the day back to their private family life, that kind of stuff. Instead, they were, members of a community. They had all kinds of functions in that community. Women especially had healthcare functions, for example, which those functions had to be extracted out of the peasant class and the working class into a profession in order for there to be a profession. And
right, like if everybody, I mean, obviously if every woman, but also if everybody was taught a bunch of not just first aid, but beyond that, like ways of caring for one another as just a way of educating us in our upbringing, there wouldn't really be a profession. There would obviously still be a role for somebody, called nurse, but it wouldn't be a monopolized position. With the point of monopolizing that position is that it adds artificial value to it. This is where libertarians are correct when they critique modern healthcare. Is like a lot of these professions are artificially inflated, and that's why they're so expensive, because of all of the gatekeeping, all the regulation, right? So, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, and
one second.
You bet.
All right, I think we're back. Sorry, so you were saying about we're on the Ehrenreich book, right?
Yep. Well, I was just making one comment real quick, is just, I just want to add that, she's not, of course, arguing for a return to the Middle Ages. Instead, like, there's been important developments, like part of capitalism is reinvesting in capital, which, allows the creation of incredible technology that never could have existed in the Middle Ages. And, it takes special training in order to use that new technology, to learn the disciplines of neurology versus immunology, etc. So she's taken that kind of advanced body of knowledge into account, but it's how do we get there without keeping people out? Okay, so then she's essentially looking for a classless society that, she's even proposing, like, thinking of it as like, not that everyone's working class, which is definitely what she's saying, but I think she's saying provocatively, well, what if everybody was PMC? But by that, she meant, like what if we had a proletarian revolution where everybody had access to, she's arguing for with the PMC. This book is definitely about feminism and not about PMC, but I think it weaves in all of the things that we're talking about. This is the vision that is implicit in feminism, a society that is organized around human needs, a society in which child raising is not dismissed as each woman's individual problem, but in which the nurturance and well-being of all children is a transcendent public priority, a society in which healing is not a commodity distributed according to the dictates of profit, but is integral to the network of community life, in which wisdom about daily life is not hoarded by experts or doled out as a commodity, but is drawn from the experience of all people and freely shared among them. This is the most radical vision, but there are no human alternatives. The market, with its financial abstractions, deformed science, an obsession with dead things, must be pushed back to the margins, and the womanly values of community and caring must rise to the center as the only human principles. And I just remembered one more thing, and I actually can't remember where I put it, but I had one more quote I was going to read from her, but I can just summarize it. Just that there was actually another essay that her and her husband at the time, John Ehrenreich, wrote that was about the medical industrial complex, was the name of it. And it wraps up by saying, like, the medical profession, for example, essentially, instead of having all kinds of barriers and stuff like that, and ripping knowledge out of the working class into the profession, instead she's imagining a future society where you have collaboration with your medical health professional. And I think that helps us think a lot about what we're talking about when we talk about the PMC, and kind of like how we should be relating to the PMC and how the PMC should be relating to the working class. And that again, this isn't about having some new term that we can throw about as as a to slander some group of people that we dislike or something like that, but instead that they're doing some academic work about trying to analyze what's the world that we live in, and how can we transform it into a better world. All right, I'm good.
Thank you, Elton. Yeah, so we're the first essay, and I would call this the primary text, is the first essay by Barbara and John Ehrenreich. Whereas that one focused on the rise of the PMC at the turn of the century from the 19th into the 20th. This one focuses on the new left, the rise of the new left. Really, you could almost say the first one could be called, the murder of the old left. It could be called the murder of the old left, and then the next one could be called the rise of the new left. And both have to be understood in terms of the PMC, right? And the basis of that thesis, that it could be called that if it had a more provocative title, is that the progressive vision of working class conciliation with the capitalists that would be managed by the PMC, that vision that was articulated explicitly by the new vision for education, as well as the new vision for political and economic reciprocity, right? This whole approach is something we can kind of just put into, it's Taylorism. We just call it Taylorism, right? And you really did a fantastic job in the very first week establishing that by reading from Taylor's Principles of Scientific Management, right? But it wasn't just him. He was just the best or most influential in terms of articulating this progressive vision that the likes of Woodrow Wilson, the Carnegie Institute, the Rockefeller Institute were all on board with at that time. This has been our general focus for this lecture, or this lecture series so far. What we've not gotten into is the sort of, the natural thing that people associate PMC with, which is identity politics. Why do we associate it with identity politics? Well, because the mode of the left as it exists today, insofar as there is a thing considered left and there are people who consider themselves left, even the people who are critical of identity politics capitulate to it or assume an audience who speaks to it And this is why every time inequality is spoken of and something's harmful for everybody, we've always got to add, but it's especially harmful for Black trans women or something like that. And the appeal is being made to a particular kind of PMC audience whose participation in politics is usually like a way of assuaging some kind of privilege guilt, right? That's why this is so repugnant to regular working class people in general, is because obviously having some PMC person with some salary, or at least so they're on the track towards that, telling some blue collar person, oh, well, you're so privileged because you're white or something. And it's like, yeah, but who the fuck are you to tell me that, right? Like, who are you to tell me that? Like, as though we have the same life. An example of that was a couple of years ago, someone I love very much was like, well, we have it easy, us white guys. I'm exaggerating, but I wanted to punch him in the face. Talk to me about how I've had it easy. Like, you know my life because we share skin color. That means racists have succeeded. Racists have succeeded in making you think you have more in common with me because of our skin color than I do with other poor people who are of all kinds of colors, right? So I want to talk about the role of, or the function of the PMC in race, gender, or any other ascriptive hierarchy of oppression washing class. And so a better way of doing it is to say identity washing class relations, or you could say culture washing. I'm playing off of the idea of whitewashing because whitewashing is real and people will do that. But there is a definite actually existing phenomenon of culture washing fundamental matters, or matters that are fundamentally based in economic inequality. And I am not interested in this discourse on the basis of I want healthcare and social democracy, and I'd take it, but the point is that those who advocate for something more revolutionary, yet do it within the current framework where most people involved in politics have the assumptions that they do. I do not believe that if they got the revolution they wanted, it would bring about the changes that they want unless the problems that we're addressing were taken to heart. And so I'm aware of the fact that I'm essentially calling for this kind of consciousness raising. I understand that it will always come from a minority. I do not believe that that's the solution, but it's a part of the solution. When people say they want to disregard this whole discourse and say, oh, well, the PMC is just a way of stoking resentment again, within the working class. It's not actually, it's just a way of cultivating resentment against the college educated by, right-wingers preying on the working class. Oh, fair enough. But as we've been harping on this whole course, those grifters who do prey on the working class are preying on objective antagonisms and resentment. And it's legitimate populist resentment. That doesn't make me like some of the authors who are arguing the PMC thesis a populist. I'm not a populist, I'm an elitist populist, or I'm a populist elitist. Meaning that I believe that there is the need for the talented few in every sphere of life to work with and for everyone, and to realize that just because someone else isn't in your elitist niche doesn't mean they couldn't be. Doesn't mean that there's not a possible world in the near future where they might get interested in it and decide that they want to be a part of it. And that if they do try to become a part of it or get in dialogue with you or understand where you're coming from, condescension and, oh, well, you just Google it for yourself, and, oh, like, who are you? That kind of attitude of, oh, well, oh, you're kind of late to the game, that's not going to cut it. For me, the point is that any elite activity and philosophy, properly speaking, is a sort of elite activity. Understanding the world itself is a sort of elitist activity. Nobody thinks that the farmer knows as much as the person who studies whatever science or whatever the object of some field is, right? The point is to make it accessible, and then to free up the time and energy so that people can explore their talents, and then, as you were saying, Ehrenreich says, freely pursue the things that they're interested in. People need to be able to pursue their individual interests, which are never truly individual, because interests wrapped up in desire is always desire of the other. So a person whose entire life is farming today, their interests could be expanded because they might be able to explore their talents and meet people they find inspirational and who they want to compete with or cooperate with in various playful ways, right? They might decide, oh, I want to get into philosophy, but that would require time and energy, because what stands between that person and their possible future self who could be into that stuff is not just the objective lack of energy-infused blocks of repeatable time energy. It's also time-energy fragility, which is the subconscious reaction, the knee-jerk defense mechanism that we all feel when somebody's telling us we need to do something that would require a shit ton of effort, and we do not have the energy to go do our taxes, much less pay our bills. And then someone's telling us to have a voice, we have to do X, Y, and Z things, and that person's saying it in an elitist, condescending way. The fact that some people want to say that this is somehow irrelevant to social change is very reflective, I think, on the situation. But the point of time-energy fragility is to be sympathetic, because we all experience it. Time-energy is a universal lack. Even the PMC, who has a relatively larger share of, I wouldn't say free time, but the ability to kind of choose when and how to do things, right? Most PMC jobs come with a little bit more autonomy. It doesn't mean that means that you're freed up to pursue your own interests. Like, Elton, do you have time to read The Science of Logic this year?
I'm not going to be able to squeeze that in. No.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you would want to if I had the time and you had the time, and Cadell Last, who's leading it right now at the Philosophy Portal, and he's read it before and he's reading it again and everyone's having a great time. Here we are, not able to participate, right? Even though you're able to do this, you're not able to do that, because that would require so much more effort. And imagine if you were trying to have an opinion on something, or share your thoughts, or have a voice, and someone was like, no, you have to read The Science of Logic. And obviously, like, not everyone should have to, and not doing so doesn't make you lesser. And some people just want to play soccer their whole lives, and more power to them. And I think that some people will do jiu-jitsu, some people will play the violin, and some people will do a variety of these different things. But right now, people work full-time and then have a hobby for whenever they have a random burst of energy on their free time. But that the hobby activities are rarely language skills, as I talk about in Waypoint, which is different than a bicycle skill. A bicycle skill, you'll learn it with, like one weekend or a couple of weekends, and now you've got it for life, and you can do it whenever you have the freed up time and a burst of energy. But language skills require energy-infused large blocks of repeatable time, which is time energy, which is the primordial phenomenon that every organization of every society that has ever existed presupposes, and then kind of creates a habitus of capture for ways of organizing everybody's time energy. But even if you find yourself with freed up time and energy because of COVID or because of unemployment, it doesn't mean that you have, found a community of possible recognition or care where your desire has been expanded through meeting inspirational people or ideas and feeling called or feeling like you want to explore. So it doesn't mean that that's there, because other people also don't have that time and energy. And the people who have specialized in these various areas aren't talking to you, and they don't think that you really are a part or even a possible participant in the conversation, which is why today there is no Theory Underground besides Theory Underground. Theory Underground is the only thing doing what Theory Underground is doing. And I should start saying it. Mikey was saying a level of arrogance is okay when you're coming from the bottom, because if you're doing something no one else is doing, nobody higher above you is going to be like, yeah, awesome, right? You might get a couple people who are like, you're kind of in a similar situation who are like, hey, you're doing something unique. The point is where's the introduction to the theory discourse? Where's the introduction to the philosophy discourse for regular working class people who don't have the time to do the readings? We've made the excerpts and the essays in this course available in audio and video form via the exegetical readings in this playlist on the channel, and as well as on the course. Obviously, I'm still charging a fee and blah, blah, blah. There is like this level of gatekeeping. I'm also not trying to reach just anybody and everybody. I'm working with what I feel inspired to do and hoping that other people will get something out of it. And at this point, there are other people getting something out of it, and so it seems to be working. But about the paying thing, just side note, I did just set up a scholarship, and we did just get one person saying that he's thinking about putting $1,000 towards that scholarship, which would mean that if you ever want to take a Theory Underground course, go to theory-underground.com/scholarship and fill out the form. And yeah, I mean, we want to make it accessible. If you're working in an Amazon warehouse and you're literally too broke, or if you're unemployed, then go for it. But if you're a student, come on, just take out the student loan and pay me, okay? Pay me. I spent my student loans on all of this. I'm still coasting off of student loans that I used to build my tiny house that I sold, and now we're using up those savings living here in Mexico. Why are we living in Mexico? To save money so that we can do Theory Underground, right? It's all bootstrapping and hijacking and life hacking our way through these things, because that's what you got to do when you're doing shit on the underground. But the lecture today is called Identitarian Taylorism of Discourse. I said it's about identity politics, but I want to think about it differently. People tend to think about identity politics in a couple of ways that are basic brain patterns, and I think that a lot of those ways of thinking, whether you're for or against, are in themselves thought-terminating cliches. And we can get really in the weeds with that conversation. What I'm concerned with is Identitarian Taylorism of Discourse. The subtitle of this lecture is Legitimate, and I have been saying most of the things I wanted to say in this lecture. I just said it before talking about the title, which is kind of quilting it, right? I don't want you to think, oh, well, now you're starting the lecture after talking for 15 minutes. No, it's been this whole time, don't worry. But yeah, so the subtitle is Legitimate versus Illegitimate Ascriptive Hierarchies and Those in Charge of Arguing for and Against Which Are and Which Aren't Legitimate. I know that's a very wordy subtitle, but it really says it all, and I will do my best to put it into plain speak. So ascriptive is a noun that means the act or an instance of ascribing a quality, characteristic, quotation, artistic work, or other object to someone or something. It's not that useful, actually, but it's the word that Dr. Adolph Reed Jr. is using throughout the recommended reading that I did an exegetical reading of that's very long. It's like a 30-page essay called The Souls of Black Folk Then and Now. Or actually, no, I think it's called The Color Line Then and Now. I say The Souls of Black Folk because the concept of the color line, as it's been popularized for the last 100 years, is due to the text, the amazing text by W.E.B. Du Bois called The Souls of Black Folk. And when I say it's an amazing text, I mean that he went and talked to thousands of black farmers and sharecroppers and small business owners, and he was just doing real sociology before it was cool. And The Souls of Black Folk is what he wrote as a result of all that. It's a literary masterpiece. Theoretically, I have problems with it because he refers to black people as a class. The idea that he's saying the color line is the line of the century, at the time that he's writing that, makes a lot of sense because of what he was dealing with at the time, which was everyone being subjugated, living under legally enforced segregation and racist laws. Okay. And so obviously there are still various ways that these things persist in the legal system, which is why critical legal studies, which became later CRT, is still important for people doing reformist work within the legal structure. But there was more of a reason to say that the color line is the thing at the time. And that is because if you broke the laws of legally enforced segregation, then you were lynched, right? Hard to say, yeah, we should all just work on the basis of class when you try and then they kill you for doing it, right? Like sorry, from the standpoint of a Black working person or an intellectual like W.E.B. Du Bois, this has to be addressed first. So a sort of race reductionism makes absolute sense in that case. What is the color line? It's like the strike line. You cross over the line to the other side. Now you're on the side of the cops and the bosses. You're a class traitor. You're a scab. We're gonna kill you. Like you are doing so much damage to the movement, if you cross the union line. And so because the time that Du Bois is writing, most struggles, the most prominent ones, have been working class. These lines, this metaphor of the line in the first place, as well as the idea of class warfare and the associated logics of class warfare, were all ready to hand for him to adopt into the fighting racism agenda, which absolutely mattered. There are pros and cons that come with this. We must be critical. And I am out of my lane right now. I am not supposed to talk about this, according to some people. There are some people who would just make me their example to the end of eternity online for even talking about this, for being so far out of my lane. We're at a time right now when radical Black professors are getting canceled because they didn't teach enough anti-Blackness, anti-Black racism studies, right? So it's like the author of the article that Zizek recently referenced in that Wokeness is Here to Stay article, that he references this Black professor who actually wrote an article for a compact called something like being an anti-racist professor in like crazy times, or in a neoliberal hellscape, or something like that. So definitely worth reading. It's quite the eye-opener. Basically, the students, he's teaching about anti-Black racism, but he's just not teaching about it enough. He's also teaching about other kinds of struggles, and they threw him out over it. This is one of a lot of these wild examples that are kind of indicative of things right now. And a lot of professors are kind of self-censoring and kind of worried about it. And so that's coming from a radical Black studies professor. Here I am, way out of my lane, and I'm drawing from Dr. Adolph Reed Jr., who was canceled in 2020 for supposedly being a class reductionist. Now, he's not, and the quotes that I'll be reading from today show that he's not. And it's not like he got canceled by the whole world. He just got canceled by the worst elements of the DSA, which, it's those elements of the DSA that are the reason I don't want to have anything to do with it right now. More power to you, Elton. You can make it great again, I'm sure. But people like you and Ehrenreich trying to, make it something that's not PMC cringe fest, I have nothing but respect for you. But from my standpoint, I'm not going to shut up. I will have a voice, and I will try to think, and I might mess up, but I'm going to do it. And this whole idea that I need to spend the rest of my life sitting here, staying in my lane, taking notes, nodding, and finger snapping, No, I will not do that because I actually have a brain and I want to use it, because if you don't use it, you'll lose it. As the people who keep telling certain people to sit down and be quiet prove. So I know I'm getting a little spicy, but I don't like being told to shut up. That you think, it's like if I really wanted to shut up, I would be in academia right now. But I want to be able to have a voice, even if it's only like 3 or 5 people watching it live, even if it's only like 150 to 300 people who watch it in the next like year. Cool. At least some people got to hear me, think about what I said, and then get, there's the potential of a genuine critical dialogue. A lot of the feedback I tend to get is either just supportive, just like awesome stuff, based, good work, or it's like something that completely mischaracterizes everything I've said, puts me into a position that I do not hold, and then characterizes me as something that I am not. And what do I do with this? It's like I'm like spending a lot of time with the non-talented 10th, right? With the bottom 10th in the comment sections. It's like that can have its own negative effect, but it is because there is the genuine potential for critical dialogue, the potential for it there, that makes this feel like, no, I still get to have a voice, right? And so in the last 2 lecture sessions, we talked about the rise of the PMC with Taylorism as a response to thwart popular working class uprisings, and how the modern PMC has collective amnesia / willful ignorance about this skill hoarding monopolization that de-skilled and made precarious the broader working class, right? This was tied into how the PMC, on account of its being good at school, has a sense of entitlement and deservingness combined with a scorn for the regular working person. And then this stokes the fires of popular resentment, obviously. And it's one of those things where you could point to some professor or something who like breaks the mold and is a total exception to that, and then we would just say, okay, cool, proves the point. That person wouldn't be so exceptional if if that was normal, right? If there was a lot more David Harveys and Hubert Dreyfuses trying to make this stuff accessible that they're doing in the elite universities to regular working class people online, if there was, then they wouldn't stand out like they do, would they? And in the last lecture, it came to the point where there was basically this crazy idea that you can have capitalism in effect or function without capitalists, because the old version of like a Henry Ford who built it all himself and oversaw every part of the process and set up all of it, that got erased. Like, yeah, you still have it in a few rare cases in the same way that we still have feudalism. There are still basically feudal lords in function today. There is still old wealth aristocrats today. But the general tendency in capitalist corporations is managerial control that is split between the managers that are doing the technical / social management within the local industry and the finance executives who oversee them. So you have the upper, middle, and lower management, and the finance executives are on the very top, and their job is to make sure that the books are being balanced, the profits are being made. And so the managers who are below them come into conflict with those guys from time to time. And I say guys because they are usually, but come on. I'm also just saying it because it includes women. Finance executives have their own antagonism, though, with the finance capitalists who are basically doing the same thing that the finance executives are, but they're doing it on a bigger scale, usually between different plants that exist in, or plants or businesses, whatever, that exist in different regions, right? So you might have the local managers and finance executives, and then you have like these non-local finance capitalists, and those guys might decide to cut funding to one local area and send and put it out of business and fire everybody and send the money in some other investment direction. Those finance capitalists, I mean, if you want to think about pop culture, the show Billions, Bobby Axelrod is a finance capitalist. He he doesn't even really have his own capital. He comes from the Bronx or something like that. He's a working class guy with a big mathy brain. And what he does is he invests other people's money, kind of like a Warren Buffett, right? His whole role is being good at investing other people's money. And sure, he cuts himself a share and he gets his own share in all of the things that he's investing in. Also, these managers on the ground, these finance executives, they all have their stake in these companies as well. And that stake has gone up over time in various sectors. And so there's a lot of ways that this thing we're calling PMC, when it's in the corporate sphere, is crisscrossed by internal antagonisms. But at the same time, they have a unified antagonism towards the actual workers themselves because they don't want them to strike. And because they don't want them to feel like they could run the thing themselves. And because they don't like being taxed too much. And because they would prefer that people think in terms of disparity instead of injustice. And that's part of where we're going to with the Reed essays. He's going to talk about this switch towards the language of disparities because that essentially obfuscates injustice, like real injustice. But the fourth category that I've left out, besides the managers on the ground, the finance executives at the local areas, the finance capitalists who oversee a lot of these different areas, and finally, it's the fourth, the shareholders themselves. And the shareholders are obviously just people who have a lot of money, who are having it invested by the finance capitalists and who might sit in on some meetings, but mostly the finance capitalists get proxy votes. And sure, they have their own little wars. Shareholders might have some special feelings about this company or that company, and they don't want it to be put out of business by the finance capitalists. But the finance capitalists are saying, no, but it's losing us money. And the shareholders say, wait a little bit longer. There are such a thing as activist shareholders. The activist shareholders from the Netherlands who have big stake in Idaho Power have actually made it so that Idaho Power is phasing out all of its coal plants. So, shareholders, not a unified front. And then, of course, there's also the fact that shareholders are also PMCs. And so you could even say there's like small petty bourgeois and working class people investing small amounts of their savings into the pockets of these finance capitalists who then invest it into Wall Street and make big decisions about where it goes and what happens with it, right? So that's the situation. It's a lot more complicated than Henry Ford. We can't just go kill Henry Ford and say, all right, everybody, the factory's ours and everyone knows how to run this shit themselves. Nope, the point of multi-layered management that's so complex now and has hoarded so many skills is to de-skill all of the lower parts, and because they all needed a college education, they've internalized, for lack of a better word, a set of habits and beliefs that are contrary to general working class common sense and make it difficult for them to see common cause with their rank and file workers. And when I say common cause, I don't mean a rise in wages. I already said I'm not interested in the social democratic things. It would be nice, but come on, the planet's burning and automation exists right now, and it could be harnessed to put most regular working class people out of business, meaning we take away the least dignified forms of labor, we automate the worst jobs, we get rid of the bullshit PMC jobs, and then we redistribute the remaining dignified forms of labor. And a lot of the shittiest jobs that can't be automated very effectively could be just basic social chores that's, we can, you have to do a certain amount of like 5 hours of community service a week. And you know what I mean? Like it could be, with radical transformation is more possible today than it's ever been in the history of this planet as far as we know. I mean, unless the fucking, ancient alien shit's real. Like it seems like right now it's probably the most technologically advanced we've ever been. We have more possibility, but at the same time that we have so much possibility, all people want to focus on is Black Lives Matter. Yeah, of course they do. What else are you asking for? Black business matters. Yeah, of course it does. What else are you advocating for? Black people should be able to advocate for their own, have their own autonomy over their local areas, and they should be able to organize and have their own communities. Cool. Okay, what else is going on right now? Trans rights, right? Like, trans people need to have access to the healthcare that they need. Sure, of course they do. We go down the list of identity issues that are the hot topics of today. Schooling, we can talk about schooling and all of the debates over what should be taught. And obviously it's wrapped up in race and gender and sex. Yeah, Elton.
I was just gonna add real quick that I was on LinkedIn today, which of course is like a PMC exclusive website for excuse me, making connections with other coworkers and that kind of stuff. But and I noticed that you can add a banner to your profile at the top, and so one option is like showing it's kind of like artwork in the office. Another one is work-life balance, which is just like some work stuff and some office stuff that it's actually pretty nice design. And then the rest, and I support 100% every single one of them, but are Black Lives Matter and trans rights and different things. It was one of those things where honestly it's just kind of like, if I'm looking for a job, I'm surprised to see that the focus of a PMC website really is almost exclusively, and when I say this I mean like 95% of the banners were some kind of left political campaign, which are it's of course like awesome to see that kind of change in the last 5 years. It probably wouldn't happen maybe 10 years ago. But it was also pretty shocking to see that that was the focus heavily there.
Yeah, it's like Amazon. When you go in, everything's rainbows, and not every, like 1 out of 5 Black people has a hat that says Black people of Amazon. 1 out of 5 Latinos has a hat that says Latinx at Amazon, etc. And so obviously this is what people call corporate wokeism. People who call it that just mean that there's real woke ideology, and then there's this kind of co-opted version of it. And that's a whole other can of worms that I think a lot of the substance of what I'm about to get to will address. But the point is like, it's not just corporation. I mean, a lot of these emphases and talking points and movement terminating slogans have been developed in rooms by people who could have been diverse and cared about inclusion, but have absolutely no broader conception of what capitalism even means if they do say that they don't like it or whatever. Usually they just mean they don't like white, greedy men, right? We don't like greedy men. We don't like competitive boys. So that's capitalism. That's patriarchy. Capitalism, patriarchy, the same thing. If we can just fight patriarchy, then that'll take care of capitalism, right? That's the idea, right? And I mean, they're the ones who come up with the things. They're the ones who get the funding, right? And so BLM is not a monolith in the sense that it's not a homogenous entity. And there's a huge difference between the organization that gets the funding and the people who write the about section on the webpage, and then actual people on the ground. And then there's a lot of diversity between local areas. Okay, some of those areas are a shit show. Some of those areas are doing real good work, and they've got a mature approach to what they're doing. I'm less concerned with that than I am with the essential thread that Dr. Adolph Reed Jr. develops, which is a critique of the PMC in how it goes in hand with identitarianism and essentialism. So we need to define those terms. And I wrote, identitarianism is making one's identity the authority in discourse, the thing that all discourse must center around and capitulate to. Essentialism is the gatekeeping of who can or cannot be considered a legitimate member of the group and which identities are okay or not to occupy certain positions in ascriptive hierarchies. The PMC is the class that ideologically maintains the ascriptive hierarchies by arguing against some while in favor for others, because this confirms its class interest and job security. This would be true of the debates in the culture war between the left and right PMC. And there is a right PMC. They want to act like there's not, right? But there is a right PMC. They just use petty bourgeois rhetoric to try to make working class people feel like they can become petty bourgeois, and then they're represented by Elon Musk because they might have the you can do it too is the basic idea, as long as you have enough personal responsibility and abstinence. So the PMC, though, when I say that it ideologically maintains the ascriptive hierarchies by arguing against some while in favor of others, a lot of the ones, so how often do you actually find like a left PMC person arguing in favor of some ascriptive hierarchy? They don't really argue in favor of ascriptive hierarchies. That would run counter to the idea of equality. But there are obviously if you're only focusing on arguing in favor of certain ascriptive hierarchies, like black excellence, for instance, well then obviously you're not thinking about the other ascriptive hierarchies that are not being challenged, right? If you're only challenging white supremacy, you're not thinking about other ascriptive hierarchies that exist. And one of Adolf Reed's main points in the Color Line Then and Now is that the problem with race, class, gender as the three main vehicles of identitarian essentialism for the PMC is that they... Oh God, I'm losing my thread here. What is he doing? I'm just gonna read my fucking notes. So anyway, yeah, God, I lost my thread in like that other week too, and I don't normally lose my thread like that, but yeah. Okay, here we go. So in that article, his point is that these debates over whether race is essentially biological or cultural or psychological or socioeconomic all miss the point. They're all just arguing over a way of what would be the right way of having this ascriptive hierarchy in place, whether it be capitalism itself, a more representative, more woke capitalism, which is kind of like never said but assumed, or whatever. And the example he uses is Hurricane Katrina, and how because the black PMC, with its sort of middle class, real estate ties, wanted to shift the focus that originally started by saying, like, look, the black population is fucked in this situation. It was really the poor black population that was fucked. And there was also poor white people who were fucked in that situation. They shifted the the black PMC and the liberal class, like MSNBC, NPR types, shifted the conversation to talking about, the underclass this has made us realize what a problem we have with this underclass, and we need to address this. And the issue of black home ownership became the emphasis. Well, when black home ownership becomes the emphasis and making sure that the people who were formerly black homeowners are able to have homes again, well, yeah, now we're talking about the black PMC, but what's been left out is this group that's predominantly black and is huge, but also includes white people and other ethnicities, being called the underclass. And the whole thing got framed around, well, they weren't homeowners, they were in the projects. Those projects were concentrating crime into one area. So we had a lot of people on drugs and, single mothers and absentee fathers. And it ushers in that whole Moynihan Report style critique of poverty that is really like a sort of dog whistling racist way of talking about poor black people that's instead, oh no, it's the underclass and it's about responsibility. And obviously this is something that Reagan and Moynihan promoted, but also that neoliberals like Biden and Clinton took up and advocated for strongly. So of course, if the solution to the poverty in the underclass became, well, they just need to be dispersed. They can't be all put together. Which, by the way, new towns and new cities are pretty good at that. That's why places like Boise, Idaho don't have a ghetto per se. There's mixed neighborhoods is the solution that gets advocated for by people who are talking about the underclass. Mixed neighborhoods, and then you'll also find small trailer parks hidden behind shopcos or whatever, like small trailer parks. But the point is, you don't put all the trailer parks together, right? That gives people an awareness of their situation, and then they protest, like poor people always have. So anyway, poor people who are aware of their situation always have. Okay, so I want to read, though, from a quote by Dr. Adolph Reed Jr. When I said that he's not really this class reductionist that he was made out to be by the DSA, I want to just say, I'm not surprised people misunderstand him. You can watch him have a conversation with Michael Brooks, and he had many, and they're definitely worth watching. Not just because, rest in peace, Michael Brooks was a beast and totally badass guy, but because their conversations are just fantastic. But if you listen to Dr. Adolph Reed Jr. talk, he has a harder time holding on to his thread than I do. He brings in so many things that are like additions mid-sentence, and he uses a lot of big words, and it's just not easy to follow. He is easier to follow if you're reading slowly, but even then, like I said, lots of big words. This guy's not writing to an audience, to a popular audience. I don't know that he's ever written a popular book. The new one he wrote, maybe, but he's writing to, he's writing in the sort of discourse that the Harvard PMC, CRT, Kimberly Crenshaw people are writing in, right? He's writing in the same, he's intervening in that discourse. So he's not going to he's not going to be less technical. He is going to engage them at the level that they're engaged at. And also I would just say, when people are like, oh, you need to use fewer words and you need to just say what you mean in a plain way that a 5-year-old can understand. Can you imagine being a black intellectual who's been told your whole life, oh, you're white because you like to read and write, right? And then he says, fuck it, I'm going to keep thinking and writing and developing my intellect. And then people are like, now you use big words. So I totally defend his right to write this way. But let's go. I'm going to read it. This is one of the important sections from the one I did an exegetical reading from a couple weeks ago. It goes, unnoticed in the persisting debate over whether and to what extent manifest inequalities stem from racism, right? Like whether or not obvious inequalities stem from racism and the debate that happens around that. He says, unnoticed in that whole debate is that both sides in effect acquiesce in the presupposition that only inequalities resultant from unfavorable treatment based on negatively sanctioned ascriptive distinctions like race qualify as injustice and warrant remedial action, right? The debate over whether inequality is manifest inequalities are stemming from race, both sides are reifying this idea that the only ascriptive hierarchies and distinctions worth challenging are ones that are like race, right? Which naturalizes the other ones. And that's part of his point with Hurricane Katrina, is that the inequalities are there. These are language games. People can talk about it in terms of race or something else, but it's there, right? This constraint, as well as the fact that it goes unnoticed, is both accommodation to and expression of the triumph of neoliberalism as the common sense ideological and programmatic framework for discussing inequality or injustice, right? This just becomes the only way that people talk about it. Anti-egalitarians and other conservatives argue that such racial inequalities as exist result from neutral workings and market forces and or intrinsic failings, cultural, behavioral, increasingly, once again, biological, right? He's a big critic of the bell curve book. You know, he takes that apart in his class notes book. So basically he's saying that one way that the anti-egalitarian and conservative side of these, well, does race have something to do with inequality, or like what's the causal relationship here? Yeah, they take up the actual racist position that he is against, and it is a racist position, and he is against it. So you can't say that he's not an anti-racist. But anyway, he says, I'll reread the sentence now. Anti-egalitarians and other conservatives argue that such racial inequalities as exist result from neutral workings of market forces and or intrinsic failings, cultural, behavioral, increasingly once again biological, of the poor and economically marginal, and therefore do not qualify as evidence of persisting racism. That's a conservative position. Anti-racists respond by demonstrating that market forces are not neutral and are in significant ways racialized, and that seemingly pathological and maladaptive behavior is often either a rational adaptation to unequal and badly constrained conditions, right? That's where you say, well, any kind of, brutality, criminality that's seen in the project, that's just people reacting to the situation. And obviously, the basic structural environmental critique is like, yeah, that makes a difference for people. They're coping, they're finding a way of cope, and nobody's got like the ideal way of coping in that situation. Like, how do you be a dignified human when you're in animal conditions, right? It's an extreme example, but that's how we talk about Auschwitz. People were reduced to the level of animals in this sort of, but worse than that, like interned animals, right? Not able to have a dignified life. It's not possible, right? That's what poverty does to us, right? Anti-racists respond by demonstrating that market forces are not neutral and are in significant ways racialized, and that seemingly pathological or maladaptive behavior is often either a rational adaptation to unequal and badly constrained conditions, the product of past or current racially discriminatory institutional arrangements, or both. To that extent, neither side in the argument challenges the presumption that only inequalities resultant in some way from stigmatization of ascriptively defined populations are objectionable to the point of justifying political intervention, right? Both sides of these debates assume that the descriptive hierarchies they're not challenging are natural or normal or not worthy of political intervention. Unjust inequality, thus construed, becomes in effect a boutique phenomenon, applicable only to discrete population segments or categories rather than a tendency rooted in the core mechanisms that reproduce the social, political, and economic order in general. So in short, the maintenance and reification of ascriptive hierarchies, this is me now, I'm just going to say, the PMC's role is to rationalize these, argue over which ones are okay, which ones are not. Who gets to speak? The authentic representatives of the whole and its interests, right? Black people, right? Remember when everybody thought Clyburn speaks for black people, right? That was in 2020. I think he was a South Carolina senator. And people were like, yeah, he likes Biden. There you go. He is black people. Okay, yeah, he definitely represents the interests of some real cool people. I have no doubt about it. I have no doubt that I would be humbled by, to be in a room by the people who Clyburn represents. But they are not all black people, and they're definitely not the majority of black people who are working class and not the PMC people that Clyburn actually represents. Okay. So this is where the essentialism aspect comes in. Who gets to be the authentic representatives of the whole and its interests? Which is why also, incidentally, that comes into how the expectations put on an influencer. And I'm not trying to be an influencer. My role is to hopefully, I'm doing my own educational thing. I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to develop myself. And if it's beneficial for other people, great. But I'm not trying to tell people what they should think, right? Well, the reason there are such extreme pressures put on anybody in an influencer role, though, is because influencers are the gig economy kind of PMC. They are the Uber drivers for the PMC. They are the freelance PMC. And so there are tremendous pressures put on them to be authentic representatives of the group that they're speaking for and its interests. I say interests, which are also kind of usually assumed to be unified, homogeneous, etc. So if someone disagrees, appeal to false consciousness, right? What's that? It's another borrowing from Marxism, which is to say they've internalized the ideology of the enemy, of their oppressors. And so that's why someone like Dr. Adolf Reed Jr. might get called an Uncle Tom, right? That's why someone like John McWhorter might get called that. That's why somebody like, is his name George or John Laurie? George Laurie? Whatever, but he's the conservative guy. So I just listed a conservative, a liberal, and a leftist. Point being, all three of them will get called that, right? And they get called that by someone who just wants to denounce them. Everything I'm saying here, because it's just the way the PMC works and the stuff that anybody in a PMC position has to deal with and assume, is also applicable in every other form of activism, all right? Obviously, maybe in 2020, it was more extreme if you're a Black influencer, right? But the same thing would be if you're a trans influencer. You still have these pressures to be the authentic representative of the whole and its interests. And anybody who disagrees with you must be one of the bad ones who's internalized the enemy's ideas, right? Taylorism, this is where we get to the discursive Taylorism thing. Taylorism, remember, the rise of the PMC comes with Taylorism, the scientific management of the workplace. Taylorism has to do with the de-skilling of labor for most working class people and the skill hoarding of a very talented few at the top. Taylorism also had its ideological apparatus evolution. And so what I've been describing is not just identity politics, as people talk about, right? It's not just essentialism and neoliberalism or whatever. No, everything that I'm talking about is a form of discursive Taylorism, meaning there are lanes and you're not allowed to go outside of your lane. Every specialist stays in their wheelhouse. And we'll have a few specialists speak for each of these marginalized groups, and they get to be the authentic representatives. Bell Hooks and Cornel West, they are the authentic representatives. Kimberly Crenshaw and Kimberly X. Kendi, they are the authentic representatives. And if you disagree with them, well, then you're just wrong. You're racist, you've internalized whiteness, etc. Right? Taylorism establishes this idea of there are lanes, only those with expertise get to be in those lanes, and you either agree with those people, the experts, or you're one of the bad ones. You should just go to the Republican Party, is the idea. So were you able to hear me talking while you left, Elton?
Unfortunately not. Nope.
Wonderful.
But
okay, no worries. So basically I brought it, I tried to bring everything together so far. I'm hoping I'll be able to get through this all before you have to leave, Elton. How much longer do you think you have?
25 minutes. Good.
Okay. We'll see if I can get this done by then. I hope so. And then for the folks in the chat, we'll have a little bit of a discussion off air, the class. So Nance and Anne and anyone else from the class who's here right now. So Taylorism creates lanes of specialization. Who gets to do what because there is skill hoarding at work. That's what I was saying while you were gone, Elton. And I tied it in. Yeah. What? Yeah. So the whole
swim lanes. Yeah.
Swim lanes.
I say that as a process engineer because I'll document, swim lanes like, there's the customer and then this person and they, you've got a workflow diagram that goes across the swim lanes. So sorry.
I'm glad you clarified because I would have thought you were talking about swimming. And the thing is, that would also
a Taylorism joke. So yeah.
So I said, what does Taylorism do? It hoards skills for a few at the expense of the de-skilled mass, and it makes the de-skilled mass replaceable, exchangeable, depowers them, right? Well, when it comes to voice, what discursive has to do with discourse and having a voice? Who gets to have a voice? Discursive Taylorism is saying these few, these specialized few, get to be the authentic representatives of the whole and its interests. And if you disagree with them, then you have false consciousness. You've internalized the enemy's ideas, and then you are suspect. You're one of the bad ones. You should probably just shut the fuck up, sit down, take notes for the rest of your life, or go to the Republican Party. That's it. That's your options. Okay. Discursive Taylorism. I hope it makes sense now. Things that are debatable and made non-negotiable and dogmatic by specialists who have Taylorized discourse via IDPOL Incorporated by government, corporate, nonprofit, and the university institutions, right? That's what the lanes have to do with. So racism becomes job opportunities and job security. And I did say a thing about how we're focusing on race here because I'm using Dr. Adolph Reed Jr., but this applies to every area of activism today. If there's something bad that's happening and there's something good that you can do in the short term, then it probably applies to your sphere of interest or potential specialization. Nothing wrong with that. It's good to be an advocate. It's good to do things. But also, if advocacy circles have become insufferable, and if there are patterns that force most regular working people out, then I believe it's all rooted in what we're talking about here. I keep saying racism, but this is just as applicable to, I said sex, gender, ability, etc. The same format, if it works over here, it'll get used over there, okay? And it has to do with job security. It has to do with potential prestige. It has to do with making a lot of money and being the beloved representative of your quote-unquote community. What's not to love? Why wouldn't you want to go to college to pursue that? Of course you would. And I wouldn't blame a person for wanting to do that, right? Natural human desires for recognition and higher status, money, etc. Of course. The three main critics of this that are kind of making the rounds online right now are Norman Finkelstein, Dr. Adolph Reed Jr., and Vivek Chibber, who I've dubbed the three wise men. They are the, like, you know, from the Christmas Advent, you know, but these guys are not the only ones doing it. Catherine Liu is doing it, and she's a critic of PMC feminism in the same way that Barbara Ehrenreich was. And there are others. I would love people to share some people they think might be doing it in the comment section or in their forum posts. So anyway, racism becomes job opportunities and job security. Egging on antagonisms between people on the basis of race becomes lucrative, so long as there are real and perceived racists that can be scapegoated for the problems of capitalism. There will be good jobs for the Black PMC. This is not said so clearly or simply by Dr. Adolph Reed Jr. because he's being careful and because he's kind of trying to be as objective as possible, and he's trying to be heard by people who are going to be hypersensitive to any way that things are put, and he wants to make an impact. But we're regular working class people here, or we come from that background, and I just want to say it straightforward. There's money in it. There's prestige in it, okay? There are actual incentives and class antagonisms between the spokespeople for every group, including Christians, and the actual people that they're supposed to be representing. There's always those antagonisms, and there's always this gatekeeping and critiquing hypocrisy and talking about authenticity. This is all just part of our lives. But I said institutionalized identity politics for a reason, because the talented tenth of an oppressed group, any oppressed group, working inside and outside of the system to get basic human rights, to not be excluded from society on the basis of identity, makes sense, okay? When W.E.B. Du Bois is writing The Souls of Black Folks, this is not a position that's been institutionalized. There's guys like Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, and Booker T. Washington is a perfect example of a petty bourgeois PMC. And, you know, not to say he's not doing good things, but that's what he's functionally doing. He's telling people, well, you're responsible for your own uplift. You've got to be good at business. You've got to be good at saving, and you should, he's the guy who would have said, well, you don't like being poor, you shouldn't buy avocados, right? That would have been the Booker T. Washington of the time. And of course, W.E.B. Du Bois is like, no, that's bullshit, right? And so they had their kind of debate. So what happens though, with this struggle to get basic human rights and not be excluded from basic functions of society on the basis of identity, what happens though is once this hard work pays off, it becomes enshrined in the politics of the status quo and becomes the struggle to get recognition from the system itself. And so I'm going to pull in the quote from Mark Fisher's oft-cited essay, The Vampire's Castle, or Exiting the Vampire's Castle. He says, the vampire's castle was born the moment when the struggle not to be defined by identitarian categories became the quest to have identities recognized by a bourgeois big other. So the case study example would be Du Bois and The Talented 10th essay, which is commonly kind of critiqued for being elitist by PMCs themselves, right? Like, so it'll get, I think in the CRT reader that Kimberly Crenshaw put together, which Cornel West wrote a foreword to, someone who wrote one of the essays in there, and I think maybe multiple times, they critique the Talented 10th idea for being elitist. But the thing is they're all at Harvard Law, they're all PMC, they're not critical of the PMC. They're not. They don't have a critique of the PMC in that entire book. So using that as a case study, though, the color line represents an application of class war to skin difference. It's a radically counter-revolutionary move of the progressive era PMC, but it also makes sense in the given situation because it was the thing that had to be addressed immediately, right? But that's why it's being historically contextualized by Adolf Reed Jr. He's not saying racism's gone away, but he's saying, no, but the color line being the most important thing still, argued for as the most important thing by people today who have won their rights, who are privileged in say Harvard or whatever, who are speaking for the interests of the Black PMC and not the general working class. Whereas it made sense that the color line was the main issue at the time of segregation, doesn't mean that text speaks to us the same today as it did then. At least it shouldn't, but they read it in a presentist way. And so the color line then and now by Adolf Reed Jr. is a critique of not just how the color line gets brought into contemporary discourse by people who read it for a self-serving presentist way. And that's not to say they don't have good intent, right? That's not to mean they're scheming or, it's not, but come on. Obviously, there is like the genuine self-serving interest that's involved in being that authentic speaker who says, no, this is the fundamental thing, race reductionism. Du Bois, in this Talented 10th essay, calls for Negroes of training and intelligence, he says, to lead a specific charge against the color line, to abolish it. While now that legal color line has been lifted, the PMC nostalgizes segregation when their people were more unified and insular. Bell Hooks is a good example of this. That's her example of beloved community, was Jim Crow era Black community, right? Because everyone had a sense of, oh, we have the same interests and we're under the same oppression and we all have like the same limited scope of possibilities on a horizon. And Dr. Adolf Reed Jr., across many of his books and essays, has been not just critical of bell hooks, but of many of these authors who nostalgize segregation era community and want to rebuild it, want it back. This is why on campus today, Black-only dorms is a bigger issue than bringing down tuition or abolishing student debt or any of these other things. And I understand that there will be activists who say we can do both, but in my experience, it was just the one thing, right? It was just the segregation. So bringing segregation back now as a way of getting a special kind of recognition and compensation, right? And then ultimately what's being used is the awkwardness of being marginalized and the inherent sense of alienation and oppression that comes with that. And then saying that it's the same today as it was during the time when it had the force of law behind it, when you would get lynched if you didn't do the subservient thing that you were expected to do. Okay, this is using the double consciousness and the veil ideas from the Souls of Black Folk today as though nothing's changed. Though they still get at something real, which is the awkwardness and inherent alienation and difficulty of being the odd one out in every situation that you're in, frames this all primarily in the terms of culture and psychology, right? So we talk about black culture, black psychology, used as the explanation of poverty, right? Culture and psychology, so from the right, it's the culture and psychology of black people that explains their poverty. And from the left, it's the culture and psychology of white people that explains black people poverty. But both sides are naturalizing all of the other ascriptive hierarchies that capitalism utilizes, right? Which, yeah, capitalism is fine with you challenging any of its ascriptive hierarchies because it's got plenty of other ones you're not looking at. So anyway, my big point is we can be sympathetic to Du Bois and even people who try to keep him alive today as though nothing has changed, because racism is real and it does suck. And, I believe that we should do what we can to stop it. But the question is when it comes to radical transformation, what counts? Yeah, so I'm going to skip a lot of this because I want to close this out on time for you, Elton. But in universality and identity politics, Dr. Todd McGowan argues that one cannot articulate universality by saying all lives matter instead of Black Lives Matter. This is to tacitly accept that when lives matter more because they do in the current political arrangement. He says this is to tacitly accept that white lives matter more because they do already in the current political arrangement. Right? So saying all lives matter tacitly accepts or prioritizes white people. We understand that. If one formulates universality in this way, all lives matter, one instantly produces an exception to the universality that one proclaims. In the guise of formulating a universal, one constructs an exclusive particular. By the way, what up, Master Signified Bodies, Sid Nanda, and Humpty DMT in the chat? I just wanted to acknowledge your existence, say what's up, because I did see you there. So the argument goes that by prioritizing the excluded particular, the best way of bettering is the best way of bettering the conditions for the whole, right? By prioritizing, if you can make things good for the worst of us, then you make good things good for everyone, right? That's the argument that McGowan is advancing. It is clear that he is appealing to the actually existing left in a hope of popularizing this approach, as opposed to what BLM actually was on its site during 2020, when its About page specifically said it is focused on Black improvement, Black inclusion, Black business, and the formation of Black community. Not in any way, shape, or form did it tie that to for the good of all, for the general upliftment. So the official movement only focused on particularism without any tie to the universal. But there were indeed activists who argued within the movement for Todd's position. Okay. The problem was the Black activists of the movement, and especially their wealthier white patrons and audience, were predominantly buy-in for the PMC. We saw a version of this in Boise, where the clique of activists who claimed to speak for the movement were using their popularity to take personal reparations to their Venmo accounts. Their self-serving mode can be best described by what Mark Fisher called the 5 laws of the Vampire Castle. I've always thought that the Vampire Castle was poorly named. He was just calling it that because Nick Land was talking about the cathedral. He's over here talking about the Vampire Castle. You got these, they're all trying to talk about the same thing, and for whatever reason, they didn't know about Barbara Ehrenreich, and so they weren't talking about the PMC. But so he's talking about the Vampire Castle. And I'm going to run over the laws of the Vampire Castle. The first law is individualize and privatize everything. The second law is make thought and action appear very, very difficult. The third law is propagate as much guilt as you can. The fourth law is essentialize. The fifth law is think like a liberal. And then the thing is he's got a paragraph accompanying each of these, right? Individualize and privatize everything. I'm going to leave that for now. The main thing is they constantly make appeals to systemic this, systemic that, but it's always using individuals and their behavior as the scapegoat or the example, right? Oh, we're going to make an example of this person. We're going to make an example of that person, which is not focusing on systems. And they're basically, that approach to talking about systems basically says that statistics are the result of individuals making choices that participate in broader patterns of oppression, right? And so this is the understanding of systemic that is really just talking about statistical patterns that have some kind of a correlate mirror in microaggressions and various forms of public policy. But this is not the kind of systemic that really talks about structural conditions of possibility, okay? I'm only going to really read the law about make thought and action appear very, very difficult because I just think it's so important to everything I've been talking about concerning discursive Taylorism. Everything else is worth reading on your own. Like, obviously, propagate as much guilt as you can. It's intuitive. You know what that's about, right? Class privileged people feel guilty, and then by everyone else feeling guilty too, then we can all just kind of get let off the hook without doing anything, right? We did the symbolic thing. But no, the make thought and action appear very, very difficult. He says, there must be no lightness and certainly no humor. Humor isn't serious by definition, right? Thought is hard work for people with posh voices and furrowed brows. Where there is confidence, introduce skepticism. Say, don't be hasty. We have to think more deeply about this. Remember, having convictions is oppressive and might lead to gulags. So obviously he's got his own sort of, he'd probably say this applies to me. And I would say, fair enough. Pictures of me as a 4-year-old, I'm sitting there like this. In every picture. I was just always a very serious kid. I can't help it. But I do understand that this is so important in all social justice spaces because the gravity of what's being talked about, murder and genocide and poverty, it's not a laughing matter. It's not a place for people to be making light of things. And so, of course, people are hypersensitive to any perceived microaggression. But also, this being perceptive to any perceived microaggression becomes a way of what Catherine Liu, who we'll be reading before the next lecture, calls virtue hoarding. And I would just add that time, energy, privileged people are able to say the things that one does to be woke, where other people cannot say those things without having done the readings, without feeling disingenuous, without feeling like they're just saying it because they're supposed to. And so there are people who just go along and say the things they're supposed to because they trust the experts or the specialists who are the authentic representatives of some supposed group. And then there are people who are like, I don't have the time to do that reading, and your definition of racism sounds like it was made up in a sociology classroom that was just trying to trigger me, and I hate you. Fuck off. Not gonna do it. Obviously what I'm talking about is defining racism as power plus privilege, so that there's no such thing as racism against white people, which would mean that when a white person was lynched for having sex with a black person by the Universal Negro Improvement Association, that wasn't racism, right? Okay, try to tell the woman, the lover of that man who was lynched, try to tell her that was not racism. That that dude that got pulled out of the truck and dragged by 15 people in Portland, Oregon, who were being vigilantes during BLM, and they beat him over the head and left him with a concussion just because they thought that he was a bad person or whatever. But they held him down, and then they were all calling him names and stuff, and then someone comes and runs and just does this epic kick, and dude lost some brain cells, right? And it's just vigilante justice. But he was being targeted on the basis of being white in the situation. It's as though these things don't happen, right? And you can say, well, that's not the same kind of racism because systemically, okay, sure, systemically, power and privilege generally favors people who are whiter and rich. But What about when you're dealing with interpersonal situations in a place like a university? Interpersonal relationships in a university where everyone really is, or you all have Title IX, you all have representation, you all have legal protections, affirmative action is in play, and so working class schmucks trying to go to college, oh, you're white, we can't be racist to you, we can literally do anything we fucking want, right? Like, it's just a very self-serving, for PMC people, position. It's not very beneficial for regular working class people who have to work together. They have to work together. They're not going to be able to treat each other that way, like in reality. If you're at Mikey's Warehouse, there might be some like racist jokes back and forth or whatever as like a sort of making light of the situation. But the point is that these things that come out of a PMC spaces that seem like a good idea don't work in a regular working class environment. There is a fundamental breakdown. And then, of course, when the representative of some group feels like, oh, well, you all don't agree with me? Well, you're just reactionaries, of course, right? That causes a breakdown in dialogue. That causes self-censorship. That causes people, their very soul to corrode. When people cannot have a voice, cannot engage in discourse, cannot be a human and participate, it kills them. All right. And then to say, oh, well, then they went and they started watching Tucker. Now you're victim blaming, in my opinion. I mean, of course, they're probably a piece of shit. I wouldn't want to associate with them. But now you're victim blaming. There's a lot of victims I wouldn't want to associate with. So anyway, the politics of recognition most often emerges to stamp out the threat of a universalist project. If the authority structures can transform a universalist project into a particularist one focused on recognition, the rule of the particular, or of the global capitalist system, wins the political struggle. There is much at stake in the turn from universalism to the politics of recognition. As a result, rather than reinterpreting movements for recognition as unacknowledged expressions of universality, we should simply abandon them. This is the case with This is a Todd McGowan quote. I forgot to say that I'm back on track reading him right now. He says, this is the case of the most widespread recognition movement, the call for diversity and representation. While active opposition to diversity efforts tend to expose the racism or sexism of the critic when not coupled with a critique of racism and sexism, these efforts themselves have nothing to do with emancipatory politics. Diversity is not a leftist project. The push for diversity is an attempt to eliminate discussion of inequality in order to privilege proper representation. Rather than advocating diversity, we should attack the structures of inequality that produce a racist or sexist institution. In doing this, we will ipso facto bring more equality in representation, since the inequality can only be the result of racism and sexism in that case. But diversity and representation cannot be the primary goal. Simply increasing representation of a particular group within institutions, universities, corporations, governments does not change the inequality that creates the underrepresentation in the first place. It is a way to keep the structure of the inequality in place. Todd McGowan, from his book, Universality and Identity Politics. Now, I know we only have a few more minutes, and I know that I've said a lot, and I know that there will be those who try to make me regret saying these things. But I already said it. People should be able to speak. People should be able to try to engage in a discourse. And people should be able to go on YouTube or other platforms and try to be a part of this conversation. And this idea that you should stay in your lane and not think structurally and about how all these things are interrelated. I mean, it's one of the worst things ever. It really is. Like, it is a genocide of voice for the overwhelming majority of humans on the planet. And so when regular working people take these crazy cancellation things that happen to like professors or who really didn't do anything wrong, or maybe they did, but it doesn't merit the reaction, in all cases at least. When they take that really seriously, and people say, oh, well, it's only affecting really powerful and privileged people. No, it's not. Every little person sees what's happening to that big person and goes, oh, but that would happen to me, because I might not agree with them, but I know I would say something wrong if I started talking in public. So people don't want to talk in public, and so they retreat into the private. And of course, the breakdown between private and public is finalized. We are in the closure of that breakdown right now. It might go on for another 1,000 years, but we are in the closure of that breakdown. Nonetheless, people retreat into a sort of solipsistic solitude and try to focus on entertainment and sports, or they pick their branded identity being handed to them by the mainstream or alternative media complex, and then they throw rocks at the other side. That's not something that has potential for a future. And being told you need to say all the right things and care about this descriptive hierarchy, and you're not allowed to be focusing on the overall system, that's class reductionism. Will cancel you, Adolf Reed Jr. is not going to do it. It's not going to make anyone with an intellect shut up. It's not going to make anyone with an intellect. Well, it might actually. A lot of people with an intellect shut up. But I think that there will be an explosion of voice as we move forward, as people develop more nuanced ways of skirting, obviously, false accusations of malintent whenever some working class plebe like myself stumbles into one of these discourses, right? If someone comes out the other side of this whole lecture and goes, oh, you're just, well, okay, whatever. You're not engaging with this on a very real level, are you? So I'm going to close out on a quote by Dr. Adolf Reed Jr. from The Color Line Then and Now. He says, debating inequality on those limited terms is on one sense only a pragmatic response to the fact that the neoliberal mindset has become hegemonic truth in American politics. Inequality as such, even severe inequality, no longer seems to be a cause for public concern and action. The term itself is increasingly replaced in academic and policy discourse by disparity, precisely because the latter term is held not to be normatively loaded, that is, not to connote injustice. Because of the civil rights and women's movements, legislative, judicial, and ideological victories, discrimination on ascriptive grounds is the most reliable basis on which objections to inequality can gain the standing necessary to pursue remedies in courts and legislatures. That could be a good case for you to build your CV and your career. There's there's potential there, not anywhere else. Look over here, don't look over there. Go with what works, don't look over there. Appeal for approval from the bourgeois big other. Don't think about actually breaking down the system that's responsible. For example, when residents of the Cabrini Green Housing Project challenged, this was a Hurricane Katrina, I think. Oh, no, this is in Chicago. For example, when residents of the Cabrini Green Housing Project challenged the demolition and relocation plan adopted by the city of Chicago and the Chicago Housing Authority, they found it necessary to do so on grounds of civil rights violations, stressing the disparate hardship to the plan imposed on blacks, women, and children. Yet accepting that framework also affirms and reinforces the underlying normative principle that naturalizes, that is, removes from the realm of legitimate concern, inequalities that can be attributed without qualification to market forces or allegedly bad or irresponsible individual behavior. To put this perhaps yet more plainly, debate over whether inequalities stem directly or indirectly from racial or other discrimination backhandedly validates the view that only inequalities that result from some form of discrimination are unjust. Then I would add, it inherently reifies meritocracy, because, and I'm going to reread that last sentence, to put this perhaps yet more plainly, debate over whether inequalities stem directly or indirectly from racial or other discrimination backhandedly validates the view that only inequalities that result from some form of discrimination are unjust. Thank you. I'm so glad you're able to be here for all of that, Elton.
Yeah. I know I mentioned that I'm interested in essentially using Barbara Ehrenreich's concept of the PNC to essentially, I don't know what the word is, but just kind of like think through Mark Fisher's exiting the vampire castle,
Right.
because he didn't have that tool. Because I
He
think,
didn't.
yeah, I think that you know, there probably, by doing that, won't be like a fundamental change to the core argument or anything like that, but I think it will provide some more clarity. But I mean, you're already onto it, and um, and I think with what you're talking about with Reed, that no matter, or one thing that we're seeing is that like the PMC, in part one gained, some prestige and power. So they, acted collectively, not necessarily fully as a class, but at least as like, engineers and as attorneys and as, doctors to, kind of protect themselves and as protect their prestige, as etc. And yeah, that there's something similar that can happen in other domains, and it can be kind of invisible that that's even happened. Well, I mean, that's the whole reason why they wrote the essay in the first place, is to say like um this is sociologically what was happening and stuff like that. Yeah, I'm definitely interested in this kind of stuff because, first of all, like within DSA, for example, I want to make sure that we're building working class power and unity, and that's a multiracial working class, for example, and wanting to help socialists and workers have healthy debates, I guess, just kind of like working through these kinds of differences and disagreements, but doing it in a way that is saying that, we need to be able to have conversations. and of course, like, we're here fundamentally for winning and winning liberation, and let's find ways to have kind of like not stopping the conversation, not ending the conversation, not using like when we're talking about PMCs, just like not using your kind of class, certainly not the class prestige, but even just kind of like your values as kind of like obstacles to us finding ways to kind of have those conversations. And
Like an ad hominem.
well, what I mean is just kind of like and maybe that's getting into too much of a conversation, but like with PMC, we may have values of like polite conversation, like this is the way to have a discourse or something like that. And of course, it can also of course be like there can't be a hint of racism or like or something like that is just saying that. Yeah, go ahead.
On that note about this emphasis on polite conversation and polite, reasonable, let's agree to disagree. That's actually one of Catherine Liu's axes to grind. It drives her crazy. I think what she doesn't, perhaps, and I need to talk to her about this, I guess. What she's not realizing is that when we're talking about the radical PMC, which is just the foot soldiers for the Democratic Party, whether they know it or not, it's the opposite, though. right? Because they associate liberalism with polite conversation, so they think they're being anti-liberal by just shutting down conversation and saying this is how it's going to be. And this is why you get like this sort of pseudo-authoritarian thing. And I say pseudo because it's like it's.
Well, I was
not
going to
even-
say it is.
Yeah.
It is anti-liberal, but in the wrong sense.
In the wrong direction, right. Yeah. And I don't think she's
exactly.
advocating. She's not advocating for that either, right? But
right, yeah.
She's talking about the people she associates with at UC Berkeley and kind of in San Francisco, right?
Right. Yeah. Fair. Yeah. I'm just kind of going off in a, these are the things that I'm thinking about while we're discussing these things. But yeah, I appreciate what Reed is doing.
Everyone needs to read.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. With that, I better sign off. But next week.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for watching up until this point. I'm going to switch it over to the closeout. We're going to roll the U.S. tour advertisement because Anne and I will be, my partner, my fiance, who I will be married to by the time we are actually driving through the U.S. Hey, Elton is going to officiate, actually. Not even kidding. Yeah. And so we're very excited about this tour of the United States. I'll be touring at least one book, and we'll be talking about all of the ideas that are going on here, and hopefully finding a ragtag team of people who, like Burton in that testimonial video, have felt totally disenfranchised and isolated and by all these supposed representatives, and he just wants to think for himself. And so, you don't have to agree with me. You don't have to agree with Elton. You don't have to agree with Mikey or Anne or Brian or any of the other people who've worked with me so far with Theory Underground. Any of us, like, obviously, the point is to have a space where it's like, it's okay to get into theory. And the point of theory is so that you can understand things first. If you try to change the world without understanding it, you're just probably going to repeat patterns of whatever, these old scripts, these movement terminating slogans and all of that. And so we're going to do our part in raising the intellectual climate in the United States a little bit. And at the same time, we're going to introduce people to a bunch of radical new concepts and ideas. Or in the case of the PMC, it's not that new, but people just throw it around like it's a slur, and they don't realize that this is integral to understanding the reproduction of the ideological and repressive state apparatuses of society today. So anyway, thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to roll the ad, but if you are in the class, or if you're going to be in the class in the future, you'll want to start reading we're going to be talking about Catherine Liu. Who's the other one, Elton? Who's the other excerpt?
I remember Catherine Liu.
Okay. It's...
I should remember.
Shit, no. It's Catherine Liu's Virtue Hoarders, the conclusion from her book, and then Angela Nagel's little...
Angela Nagel, yeah.
Her little anti-clerical manifesto, which is, with Mark Fisher, he talks about the priestly behaviors of the vampire castle. Well, other people who talk about the PMC talk about the priestly similarities from time to time. That's why Catherine Liu talks about the Brahmin class sometimes, because, they were the priests of a caste society. But Nagel's going to be talking about why she thinks the PMC term is missing the point, and that what we need to focus on is the clerisy. Does Piketty talk about that?
Yeah. I think the Brahmin even comes from him, actually.
Oh, that's dope. Okay. Now I actually care about that book. I want to read it. Okay, everybody.
Yeah.
Take care.
Yep. See ya.
In an attempt to bring in new people to the world of philosophy and theory while building on relationships already established, we are doing a countrywide tour of the United States this fall.
What's up, guys? It's Ann and
Are we coming
Dave.
to a city or town near you? Do you think there is a venue or audience in your local region that would be interested in a lecture or facilitated discussion about existentialism, critiques of therapism, PMC ideology, self-help, introduction to philosophy, or the time-energy critique of any of those things? This speaking and discussion facilitation tour will include the Pacific Northwest in mid-August, the Kansas City, Missouri area late August or early September, Philadelphia at the beginning of October, and really we're going to be all over the area there, hopefully. So get in contact with us if you think that we should come visit your state. Phoenix, Arizona, mid-October, and SoCal, especially San Diego, late October. I say especially San Diego because we already have our guide for the San Diego region. What's the difference between a host, a guide, and a volunteer, you ask? Well, thanks for asking, actually. The volunteer role is for people who want to put up posters or in other ways promote the events that will be occurring in their town or city, whereas the host might have a guest bedroom, guest house, or a place that we can park our van so that we can sleep in our van. We need to know if you would have like bathroom facilities or anything like that, and so the form on the website is where you can tell us what you have to offer. Guiding, on the other hand, though, people who love to guide take a lot of pride in their local knowledge. A good example of that would be Michael Downs when I visited him in Raytown, Missouri, and he took me into Kansas City and we had barbecue, and he took me to the mall and to all these other landmark places from his life growing up there. But a more recent example would be my friend Michael in Poland, who took us around Katowice, Poland, and basically gives a historical and sociological analysis of everything, and it was amazing. It was one of the coolest things we've ever experienced, and it made us realize some people just want to provide the space and privacy, whereas other people want to take you out and show you around. And so if you're interested in being a volunteer, host, or guide, we have a special form for that, so please fill out your information and get in contact with us as soon as possible so we can fit you into the schedule, because we'll love to meet you, touch base with the local community. And if you don't think anyone else in your area is interested in the things that you're interested in, if you don't think anyone else is into this stuff, well, we might be able to surprise you.
When I saw that poster, Bold Grill Art in Boise, fucking Idaho, are you kidding me? It was virtually an answer to an unspoken prayer, really was. And I just couldn't believe that somebody was interested in the things that I was interested in, that I had been interested in for years and had kind of given up on in futility. I'd labored in solitude for so long. I had no one to talk to about it, no one to bounce ideas off.
This tour is going to bring together a lot of people who want to be based in text with the people they're in conversation with. And yeah, I think it's going to be a fantastic year. The only other thing that I want to say is that Michael Downs' first book is going to be published by Theory Underground really soon here. I've got another book coming out really soon here. These books will be spread throughout the United States on this tour. So I'm hoping to be able to do some actual book launch events at various bookstores. Outside of that, I guess the last thing that I would say is that Michael Downs is gearing up to teach For They Know Not What They Do by Slavoj Žižek. We're putting out all these introduction videos and other interviews related to the topic of Hegel, Lacan, Žižek, because we want to give people an accessible and sturdy basis in the discourse. The problem is that Michael Downs is very busy having to work at a wage slave job. And so if you want to help in freeing Mikey, make sure to go to his Patreon at patreon.com/thedangerousbaby and make a donation. Thank you. I would be remiss to close this out without a quick shout out to our patrons and our anonymous donors. Thank you so much for the donations already. We've only been around for a month. We already got over $3,000 in donations, and so thank you. And stay tuned for the app, which is on its way. There will be a Theory Underground app So the current setup is that it is a social media site built around courses where you can suppose that people who are involved in the discussions have a shared interest in the same or similar texts, and where you can assume in a lot of the discussions that, yeah, people have read the stuff that you're reading, that you're bringing into dialogue. And so, for instance, The Idea of the University by Carl Jaspers, dedicated forum. Slavoj Žižek's For They Don't Know What They Do, dedicated forum. And then as people take the course over the years, new people will be coming into that forum. And so if you get in there early, you'll be able to see how the conversation evolves. And as new people add into the conversation, it'll bring back memories and like things that you want to work through, questions that you had with the first time that you read the text. And so I'm really excited for this. The reason I've built this website is because I think that this is what's lacking in so many other spaces, is that ability to return, to be able to communicate after the fact and in a sustained way on a platform that's not attention grabby and annoying like Discord. And so stay tuned, because there is an app on the way. Thank you to our donors. If you want to donate, go to theory-underground.com/support. Thank you.